Hey everyone. In this section, we're going to discuss another type of associative learning, which is known as operant conditioning. So, operant conditioning is a learning process in which the actions consequences determine how likely a behavior is to be performed in the future. So, um, whether or not you realize it or not, you're aware of this. We use this all the time to shape behaviors. So if you have ever told a child, or you were told as a child that you need to finish your food before you can eat dessert or you can go play, or that even to yourself, maybe you make a deal with yourself and you say, okay, if I finish reading this chapter, then I'll take a little time to go play a video game or something, or whatever you find enjoyable. This is operant conditioning. So, operant conditioning, or the predecessor to this, was demonstrated by Edward Thorndike. Um, and what he was doing is he was creating these puzzle boxes, usually for cats to be able to escape. They would need to do these certain actions that would then allow them to escape out of the box and get a food reward. And from this, he developed what he called the law of effect, which was basically that any behavior that led to a satisfying state of affairs is likely to be repeated, whereas any behavior leading to an annoying state of affairs is less likely to be repeated. This was further refined by B.F. Skinner, and he developed a much more formal learning theory that was based on this initial law of effect that we called operant conditioning. And so, operant conditioning is how an animal operates on their environment to produce an effect. And so in this we have reinforcers. A reinforcer is a stimulus that occurs after the response and increases the likelihood of that response occurring. The consequences of an action then determine the likelihood of that behavior in the future. Operant conditioning is also sometimes called Skinnerian conditioning. And so the way that B.F. Skinner developed his theories was using a device known as an operant chamber. Some people call them Skinner boxes. My understanding that he really hated that name for them, but people often use that term. But basically, he used either rats or pigeons for most of his research, and he would have a way for them to elicit a response that then would allow them to get some type of stimuli back, usually a food reward. So in kind of the classic operant chamber, there would be a lever that the rat could press, and then if he presses the lever, then there would be food that would be dispensed for the rat to eat. For the pigeons, there would normally be a disc that they could peck. And then if they peck that disc, then once again, there would be a place for food to be automatically dispensed. So, what are these reinforcers? Well, there are different types. One is called a primary reinforcer. Primary reinforcers are those that are necessary for survival, such as food or water. So when the rat presses a bar and it receives some food, this is known as a primary reinforcer. Secondary reinforcers are events or objects that serve as a reinforcer but do not satisfy a biological need. So a classic example of this is money. That you could, if uh, get a person to repeat a behavior if you offered to pay them, but handing somebody a dollar bill doesn't actually satisfy a biological need. I mean, I guess you can eat it, but it wouldn't do you any good. But we know that we can take that money and then we can take it to a store and we can buy primary reinforcers or other things that we would find enjoyable using that. So that becomes a secondary reinforcer. So these reinforcers can become conditioned. So we can also see a generalization and discrimination, just like what we saw with classical conditioning. We can see that with these kind of reinforcers as well. So reinforcement makes a behavior more likely to occur. The flip side of this is known as punishment. Punishment makes a behavior less likely to occur. Now, it's important to remember that when we're talking about reinforcements or punishments, we're talking about the likelihood of a behavior occurring. We are not talking about the stimulus itself. So, for example, if I offered somebody money for doing something and their behavior decreases, that money is not a reinforcer. In that case, it is actually a punishment. On the flip side, if you had a frustrated parent who spanked a child, but they're because they were acting out, if that acting out became worse, then that spanking, which we would normally associate with a punishment, is actually in that case a reinforcer because the behavior was increasing. So we can't look at the stimuli. For one thing, stimuli are different from person to person. You might find getting a piece of candy to be reinforcing, while someone else might not really care for candy. You might find getting money to be reinforcing, whereas somebody who maybe has plenty of money doesn't really care what's another dollar to them. So the stimuli is not what determines whether something is a reinforcement or a punishment. It's rather it's the resulting behaviors. Does it make it that the behavior is more likely or less likely to occur in the future? Some other kind of important terms that we're going to be talking about is positive versus negative. So positive means that we add something, and negative means we take something away. I'll explain why that's important. So for both reinforcements and for punishment, we can have a positive or a negative. So a positive reinforcement means that I give you something and that behavior then increases. So every time a child completes his spelling homework, I give the child some candy. That is a positive reinforcement. I am giving something to make that behavior more likely to occur. On the other hand, a positive punishment would be that you are adding something. So the frustrated parent who spanks a child, that is a positive punishment because they are adding a physical they're doing something physical with the idea that that would decrease whatever behavior there was. On the other hand, negative means that we're removing something. So a negative reinforcer means that we are taking something away that is negative, such as or something that you find annoying. So when you get in the car and the car starts beeping at you until you buckle your seatbelt, that is negative reinforcement. You want the beeping to go away, so you buckle the seatbelt. They would want you to buckle up every time you get in the car, and so this increases the likelihood of you using your seatbelt if that removes an annoying beeping. Or the child who won't clean their room, so you keep nagging them, and then once they finally clean their room, you stop nagging them. So you remove the negative nagging when they did the behavior that you want. Negative punishment then is that you want to decrease a behavior by removing something. So, sending a child to a timeout or grounding a teenager, these would be things where you remove things that are enjoyable. You remove their freedom. You maybe take away their device. They can't get on the internet, or they can't use their phone. You remove things that they like in order to decrease a behavior in the future. So let's use this example with, say, we're trying to train a dog to stop jumping up on people when they first, when they see somebody. So one way we could do a positive reinforcement is that we give the dog a little cookie when all four legs are on the ground. And so that would, if the desired behavior is to not jump, then I want to reinforce when they are not jumping. When all four feet are on the ground, I'm going to reward that. I'm going to give a positive reinforcement. A negative reinforcement, once again, is because I want to increase them not jumping. So if they do jump, I'm going to remove my attention. I'm going to turn around and not ignore the dog. And so then, and when the dog then is not jumping, then I'll turn around and I'll pay attention to the dog. On the punishment side, a positive punishment could be that every time the dog jumps up, we bop it on the nose. And so that would be adding something to try to decrease a behavior. And then a negative punishment could be that we physically are holding the dog down, and then when all four legs are on the ground, you stop doing that. So you remove the aversive holding them, and that when they're doing the behavior that you desire. So it's important. People often confuse what negative reinforcement is. Both positive and negative reinforcement increase the likelihood of a behavior. So, negative reinforcement is not another word for punishment. That's where people often misuse that term. Positive and negative reinforcement increase the likelihood of a behavior. So, positive reinforcement, we're going to give a stimulus that's going to increase the probability of a behavior. Negative reinforcement is we're going to remove a negative stimulus to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Excuse me. Okay. So, negative reinforcement, we're going to remove a stimulus um, in order to increase the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. Same thing with positive and negative punishments. Once again, this is about reducing the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. Positive punishment means we're going to add something that will decrease the likelihood of behavior, and negative punishment is that we're going to remove something that is enjoyable to then decrease the likelihood of a behavior. Now, how we give these reinforcements actually have an important role in how learning occurs. So there's several different ways that we can provide reinforcement. One of these is what we call continuous reinforcement. This is when a behavior is reinforced every time that it occurs. And this can produce a fast learning, but it's not really common in a real world situation. We do that in a laboratory, but normally you don't receive a reward every single time you do something. So more often we have a partial reinforcement where behavior is occasionally reinforced. Um, and so this is what's kind of more common in the world. Another term to pay attention to is the idea of fixed versus variable. So a fixed schedule is one that is predictable, and a variable ratio is one that is unpredictable. Also, another set of terms that we're going to use is interval versus ratio. Interval means that that there's some type of passage of time, whereas ratio means that there's a certain number of responses that is needed. So let me show you how that can kind of make sense. So we can have what's called a fixed interval schedule. So a fixed interval schedule is where we have the reinforcing occurs of a behavior after a predetermined amount of time that's passed since the last reward. So you can think of somebody receiving a paycheck. Every 2 weeks, you're going to receive this paycheck. And that's your reinforcement to continue to go to work and do a good job at your work. And you know that every 2 weeks you will receive that. So it's fixed, it's predictable. You know it's going to occur every 2 weeks, and it's based on an interval, in this case, number of weeks. A variable interval schedule is where the reinforcing occurs after an unpredictable and varying amount of time since the last reward. So you can imagine if you're in a class where you could have a pop quiz on any day. And so, um, since you don't know when that will occur, this can cause a more consistent response rate than for a fixed interval because you have to constantly study because you never know when that pop quiz will occur. We can also have schedules that are based on numbers of behaviors. So, a fixed ratio schedule is where you receive a reinforcement after a behavior has occurred a certain number of times. So if somebody is being paid by completing a certain number of tasks, um, then that would be a fixed ratio schedule. And this can often yield better response rates than a fixed interval schedule. But then we could also have a variable ratio schedule where you receive a reinforcement, but you don't know how many behaviors are needed. And the classic example of this is a slot machine where you put your money in, you pull the lever, and you don't know how many times you need to repeat that behavior before you could possibly receive a cash out reward. So, when we're looking at these rates of learning, we can see that there's kind of different behavior profiles associated with each of them. So, take the fixed interval, for example. Um, I once worked in a research lab where every Wednesday we had our lab meeting with our boss, where we had to present what we'd worked on over the previous week. And there was a pattern that I noticed, very soon after starting working there, that um, we would have the meeting on a Wednesday afternoon, and then Thursday, no one did any work. Everyone sat around and they talked. They maybe were playing games on their computer. They didn't really do much. And Friday they didn't really didn't really work. But then people would realize, hey, I didn't do anything. So some people would actually like even start coming in on the weekends and like start doing some work. And then when it came to like Monday and Tuesday, they would stay there all night if needed to like get work done so they had something to present on Wednesday. And then once again, after the Wednesday meeting, then everyone goofed off the next day. And so you can look at that first graph there, you can see what we call the scallop response, where you right after the way you read these graphs, the bottom the line is time moving forward, and then the upward arrow is how many total responses have been made, and each one of those little tick marks is then that reinforcement opportunity. So with the lab meetings on Wednesdays, you didn't see you saw very little work being done on Friday or Thursday and Friday, and then you saw lots of work done on excuse me, on Monday and Tuesday. And so you can see that kind of scalloped response. Um, on the other hand, you can look at like a fixed ratio schedule. So that fixed ratio schedule also kind of shows when we know that there's a certain number of a certain number of responses that are needed in order to get to a point. Once you get the reinforcement, people typically stop. They have a what we call post reinforcement pause, and they they take a little time off because they work, for whatever it is that they're doing, and they take a little break before they then start doing the accumulated behavior again before they can get the next reinforcement. On the other hand, the variable ratios and intervals schedules tend to produce a more consistent behavior because you never know when it's going to happen. So I can think when we worked, when I worked in a restaurant, we would know that we would have some inspections that we would have would be predictable, and some would be unpredictable. There'd be surprise inspections that we would do. So we knew our regional manager, or excuse our area manager, would tend to come every Thursday, and so we would make sure Wednesday night we'd give everything an extra good little clean, so that that everything looked good when he would show up on Thursdays. So once again, that's being a fixed interval. On the other hand, we would know we would have some general idea that's when somebody was in the area doing these kind of random inspections. They would come and they would do a region at a time, and so some town, so many miles away, their manager would call and say, "Oh, I just got the surprise inspection," and so we would clean extra good every night, because we didn't know which day the person would show up, and so that would be a variable interval. We Since we didn't know when the inspector was going to come, we then did the desired behavior cleaning behaviors more consistently. And then the variable ratio is then, instead of being a time interval, is then talking about number of behaviors that you're doing. And the variable ratio is an incredibly fast and persistent way of doing learning. It's one reason why this is works so well with gambling tasks. So, um, partial reinforcement is that when we have um, that behaviors are reinforced, not continuously, when there is some kind of interval between them where the number of behaviors are in time, they are more resistant to extinction. So if you are given a reward every single time you do a task, when you then don't get the reward, you can instantly go, well, hey, something just changed. I guess I'm not getting rewarded anymore. On the other hand, if there is some type of time or number of behavior interval in there, you don't know, just because you did the task and you don't receive a reward that time doesn't mean that you're not going to receive a reward in the future. So, what we typically want to do is we use kind of a combination of both continuous and partial reinforcement. So, you maybe start off very initially. So, you think about you're trying to teach your dog to do a trick, and so initially, you are giving a little cookie to the dog every single time it does that. But then you start spacing it out after the dog has kind of demonstrated that he knows how to do the trick. that you then start spacing out, and you occasionally give a reward when they do the trick. So that then makes the behavior more persistent.